The radar operator at RAF Ventnor on the Isle of Wight watched the green phosphor screen in front of him with growing alarm on the afternoon of August 13, 1940, as dozens of bright spots appeared on the display indicating aircraft approaching across the English Channel from France in numbers larger than anything detected during previous raids. The operator quickly plotted the formation's location, speed, and heading, then passed the information through the chain of command to Fighter Command headquarters at Bentley Priory, where controllers would direct RAF fighters to intercept the incoming raid before it reached targets in southern England. This detection and reporting system, based on radar technology that was still secret and that German intelligence had significantly underestimated, would prove to be one of the decisive factors allowing Britain to survive the coming air campaign that Germany was launching with confidence that overwhelming Luftwaffe superiority would force British surrender within weeks. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, believed with absolute certainty that his air force possessed both the numerical strength and the qualitative advantages necessary to destroy the Royal Air Force as an effective fighting force within days or at most a few weeks of sustained operations. The Luftwaffe deployed approximately 2,800 aircraft for the campaign against Britain, including approximately 1,400 bombers, 300 dive bombers, 900 single-engine fighters, and 300 twin-engine heavy fighters. These forces were organized into 3 air fleets, Luftflotten 2, 3, and 5, positioned in occupied France, Belgium, Holland, Norway, and Denmark, with orders to achieve air supremacy over southern England as preparation for Operation Sea Lion, the planned German invasion of Britain that Hitler had reluctantly authorized after Britain rejected peace offers following the fall of France. RAF Fighter Command, defending Britain under the leadership of Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, could deploy approximately 700 fighters at the campaign's beginning, including about 500 Hurricane and Spitfire single-engine fighters that were the only aircraft capable of engaging German bombers and fighters on relatively equal terms. The remaining 200 fighters consisted of obsolete types like Blenheims and Defiance that were vulnerable to German fighters and that would be withdrawn from daylight operations after suffering catastrophic losses during the campaign's early weeks. The numerical disparity seemed overwhelming, and German intelligence assessed that the RAF could be destroyed through sustained attacks on airfields, aircraft factories, and supporting infrastructure before British production could replace losses. But German intelligence had made several critical miscalculations that would prove fatal to the entire campaign. They significantly underestimated British aircraft production, believing that Britain could produce perhaps 200 to 300 fighters per month when actual production in summer 1940 exceeded 500 fighters monthly and would continue increasing as factories expanded and as production methods were refined. German intelligence also failed to understand how the integrated air defense system that Britain had developed would allow Fighter Command to use its limited forces far more effectively than German planners anticipated, concentrating fighters against incoming raids rather than maintaining standing patrols that consumed fuel and pilot endurance without necessarily engaging enemy aircraft. The British air defense system that would prove so effective combined radar detection, observer corps ground spotting, filtered information processing at Fighter Command headquarters, and radio communication directing fighters to intercept positions. The system's foundation was the chain of radar stations positioned along Britain's southern and eastern coasts, installations that could detect aircraft approaching from continental Europe at ranges exceeding 100 miles and at altitudes from sea level to over 30,000 feet. The radar information was supplemented by reports from thousands of Observer Corps volunteers positioned throughout Britain who visually tracked aircraft once they crossed the coast, providing information about formations that radar could not supply, including aircraft types, numbers, and exact locations. All information from radar stations and observer posts flowed to Fighter Command headquarters, where plotters positioned markers on large situation maps showing the location and movement of every detected formation. Filter officers assessed incoming reports to eliminate duplicates and errors, creating an accurate picture of the air situation that allowed controllers to direct fighter squadrons to intercept positions where they would encounter enemy formations. The system allowed Fighter Command to husband its limited resources, scrambling squadrons only when raids were detected and vectoring them directly toward enemy formations, rather than maintaining standing patrols or conducting time-consuming searches for enemies whose locations were precisely known through technical means that German commanders did not understand or appreciate. The communication system linking Fighter Command headquarters to the individual fighter squadrons and to ground control stations at sector airfields used radio and telephone networks that were robust and redundant, ensuring that information could flow continuously even when individual stations were damaged or destroyed. Fighter pilots received continuous updates about enemy positions, headings, and altitudes while airborne, allowing them to position themselves advantageously for attacks rather than stumbling across enemy formations through luck or through exhaustive searches that consumed fuel and time. The entire system represented Britain's conversion of technical innovation into operational advantage using radar and communication technology to multiply the effectiveness of limited fighter resources. The campaign that would become known as the Battle of Britain developed through several distinct phases as German strategy evolved in response to results achieved and to changing assessments of what approaches would most effectively destroy Fighter Command. The initial phase during July and early August 1940 focused on attacks against British shipping in the English Channel and against Channel ports, operations designed primarily to test British defenses and to draw RAF fighters into combat where German numerical superiority would produce favorable kill ratios. These preliminary operations achieved mixed results, with the Luftwaffe destroying some ships and port facilities, but also suffering fighter losses that exceeded German expectations when RAF Hurricanes and Spitfires proved more capable than intelligence assessments had suggested. Adlertag, Eagle Day, designated August 13, 1940, marked the beginning of sustained Luftwaffe operations intended to achieve air supremacy through systematic destruction of Fighter Command's airfields, radar stations, and aircraft factories. The operation began with raids by hundreds of German bombers escorted by fighters attacking targets throughout southern England. RAF fighters intercepted many of the raids, engaging in swirling dogfights that ranged across the skies of Kent, Sussex, and Hampshire, as British pilots attempted to break through fighter escorts to reach the bombers, while German fighter pilots tried to protect their charges and to shoot down the defending RAF fighters. The combat that developed during August 1940 tested both sides to their limits and demonstrated fundamental differences in how the air forces approached the campaign's challenges. German bomber crews flew in tight defensive formations designed to concentrate their defensive firepower against attacking fighters, a doctrine that worked reasonably well against isolated attackers, but that made formations vulnerable to coordinated attacks by multiple RAF squadrons, striking simultaneously from different directions. The close formations also reduced bombing accuracy, because individual bombardiers could not maneuver independently to correct their aim, resulting in bombs often falling wide of intended targets, despite aircraft successfully reaching target areas. German fighter pilots, flying Messerschmitt Bf 109s that were arguably the finest single-engine fighters in service anywhere in 1940, possessed performance advantages over RAF Hurricanes in most categories and rough parity with Spitfires in overall capability. But the Bf 109's limited range, approximately 410 miles with external fuel tanks, meant that fighters escorting bombers to targets in southern England operated at the extreme limits of their combat radius with minimal time over target before fuel requirements forced them to break off and return to bases in France. The short endurance meant that German fighters often had to abandon bombers while still over England or shortly after attacks were completed, leaving the bombers vulnerable to RAF fighters during their withdrawal. The RAF approached defensive operations with doctrine emphasizing aggressive attacks against bombers despite the presence of fighter escorts, accepting losses from German fighters as the necessary price for disrupting bomber formations and preventing accurate bombing. Hurricane squadrons typically engaged the bombers directly, using their rugged construction and heavy armament to close to effective range despite defensive fire from bomber gunners. Spitfire squadrons engaged German fighters, attempting to prevent them from interfering with Hurricane attacks or to destroy them outright, though the tactical situation often prevented such clean division of labor and all types engaged whatever targets presented themselves. British pilots discovered during the campaign's early weeks that their peacetime training and tactical doctrine were inadequate for combat against experienced Luftwaffe pilots who had developed effective tactics during the Spanish Civil War and the campaigns in Poland and France. The standard RAF formation was the tight Vic of 3 aircraft flying wingtip to wingtip, a formation that looked impressive during peacetime demonstrations, but that was tactically suicidal in combat because pilots spent more attention maintaining formation than watching for enemies. German pilots flying in flexible pairs, the Rota, could maneuver much more effectively and could provide mutual support that made them far more dangerous than their numbers alone suggested. RAF squadron commanders who survived the early battles quickly abandoned peacetime tactical doctrine and adopted formations and tactics copied from successful Luftwaffe practices or developed through practical combat experience. The tight Vic gave way to looser formations where pilots could scan for enemies while maintaining mutual support. Climbing attacks from below replaced level approaches from the same altitude, taking advantage of the fact that aircraft were most vulnerable when viewed from below, where they showed their full planform against the sky. Coordinated attacks by multiple squadrons replaced single squadron attacks that German fighters could more easily counter through concentration of forces. The fighting during August 1940 was absolutely brutal for both sides, with aircraft losses and pilot casualties mounting daily to levels that neither Air Force could sustain indefinitely. RAF Fighter Command lost approximately 300 fighters destroyed during August, with another 170 seriously damaged, losses that exceeded production during the same period, even though British factories were producing fighters faster than German intelligence believed possible. More critically, Fighter Command lost approximately 100 pilots, killed or so seriously wounded that they could not return to combat duty, casualties that could not be replaced. Because pilot training programs required months to produce combat-ready pilots, and because the pool of trained reserves was being rapidly depleted, Luftwaffe losses during August totaled approximately 400 aircraft destroyed, including bombers, fighters, and dive bombers, with hundreds more damaged seriously enough to require extensive repairs before returning to service. German bomber losses were particularly significant because bomber crews required more training than fighter pilots, and because bombers were more difficult and time-consuming to produce than fighters. The loss of experienced bomber crews, men who had been flying combat operations since the Spanish Civil War or since the Poland campaign, represented a permanent degradation of Luftwaffe capabilities that replacement crews with minimal combat experience could not compensate for regardless of their enthusiasm or courage. The attacks on RAF airfields during late August achieved significant results, destroying aircraft on the ground, damaging runways and facilities, and disrupting operations to the point where several airfields were temporarily unusable. Biggin Hill, Manston, Hornchurch, and other critical sector stations were repeatedly bombed, their operations severely disrupted, their ground personnel suffering casualties, and their ability to control and support fighter operations degraded. Fighter Command's situation was becoming desperate as aircraft losses exceeded production, pilot casualties exceeded the rate at which replacements could be trained, and the damage to airfields threatened the entire system's ability to function. Air Chief Marshal Dowding, watching the attrition rates with growing concern, understood that Fighter Command was being ground down through cumulative losses and that the breaking point was approaching when the command would no longer possess sufficient aircraft or pilots to effectively defend Britain against Luftwaffe attacks. The mathematics were brutally simple. If current loss rates continued for another few weeks, Fighter Command would cease to exist as an effective fighting force, regardless of how bravely individual pilots fought or how many enemy aircraft they shot down. The campaign was becoming a race between the rate at which Fighter Command was being destroyed and the rate at which sustained losses in operational strain would force the Luftwaffe to abandon the campaign. The turning point came on September 7, 1940, when the Luftwaffe shifted its primary focus from attacking Fighter Command airfields to bombing London in retaliation for RAF Bomber Command attacks on Berlin. The decision reflected Hitler's fury at British bombs falling on the German capital and his belief that attacks on London would either break British civilian morale and force surrender, or would draw remaining RAF fighters into a decisive battle where German numerical superiority would destroy them. The shift in targets provided Fighter Command with desperately needed relief. As airfields were no longer under sustained attack and as damage could be repaired and operations restored to full effectiveness. The London bombing, the Blitz, began on September 7th with massive raids by hundreds of German bombers escorted by fighters attacking during daylight hours in formations that British radar operators and fighter controllers tracked from the moment they formed up over France. RAF fighters intercepted the raids over Kent and Essex, engaging in running battles that continued into the London area as German bombers pressed on toward their targets, despite fighter attacks and anti-aircraft fire. The bombing caused extensive damage in London's East End and Docklands, starting fires that burned throughout the night and that would guide subsequent night raids to their targets for weeks afterward. The raids continued daily and nightly through September with varying intensity as weather permitted, German bombers striking London and other British cities, while RAF fighters attempted to intercept and disrupt the attacks. The shift to attacking cities rather than airfields fundamentally changed the campaign's character from an air superiority operation aimed at destroying Fighter Command to a strategic bombing campaign intended to break British morale and economic capacity. The change also reduced pressure on Fighter Command to unsustainable levels, allowing the command to rebuild its strength and to recover from the critical situation that had existed in late August. September 15, 1940, subsequently celebrated as Battle of Britain Day, saw the climactic engagement of the daylight campaign when the Luftwaffe launched two major raids against London involving nearly 400 bombers and over 600 fighters. RAF Fighter Command responded by scrambling virtually every available squadron, committing forces from throughout southern England to intercept the raids in strength that surprised German commanders who believed Fighter Command had been reduced to a shadow force incapable of mounting effective resistance. British fighters engaged the raids repeatedly from the coast to London and during the withdrawal back to France, claiming destruction of approximately 185 German aircraft, though actual losses were closer to 60 aircraft with many more damaged. The psychological impact of September 15th was greater than the actual losses inflicted, because German commanders recognized that Fighter Command remained a powerful force capable of mounting strong resistance despite weeks of sustained combat. The claim of 185 German aircraft destroyed was wildly exaggerated, due to multiple pilots claiming the same kills and due to honest confusion during chaotic combat. But British authorities and the public believed the claims and celebrated what appeared to be a decisive victory. German commanders realized that achieving air supremacy over Britain would require continuing the campaign far longer than originally anticipated and would cost far more aircraft and crews than Germany could afford given commitments on other fronts. Hitler, already having doubts about Operation Sea Lion and increasingly distracted by planning for the invasion of the Soviet Union, postponed the invasion indefinitely on September 17th, effectively ending the immediate threat of German landings on British soil. The Luftwaffe continued bombing operations into October, but increasingly shifted to night bombing where RAF night fighters and anti-aircraft defenses were less effective, abandoning the daylight operations that had failed to achieve air supremacy. The Battle of Britain, as traditionally defined, ended in late October 1940 when the Luftwaffe ceased sustained daylight operations over Britain, having failed to destroy Fighter Command or to achieve the air superiority that would have been required for successful invasion. The reasons for German failure were multiple and interconnected, reflecting both British advantages and German disadvantages that accumulated over weeks of sustained operations. The integrated air defense system that Britain had developed allowed Fighter Command to use limited resources far more effectively than German commanders anticipated, concentrating fighters against specific threats rather than dispersing them across all possible approach routes. British aircraft production exceeded German intelligence estimates by substantial margins, allowing Fighter Command to replace losses faster than Germany could inflict them, while maintaining sufficient reserves that the force never approached complete destruction despite heavy casualties. British pilot training programs, while unable to replace losses completely during the campaign's critical weeks, produced sufficient replacements to maintain operational strength, even if average pilot experience and skill declined as veterans were killed or wounded and were replaced by inexperienced pilots with minimal training. German pilot losses, particularly among experienced bomber crews and fighter pilots, could not be replaced adequately because Luftwaffe training programs had not been designed to sustain the attrition rates experienced during the Battle of Britain. The loss of irreplaceable experienced crews permanently degraded Luftwaffe effectiveness in ways that no amount of new aircraft could compensate for. The Bf 109's limited range fundamentally constrained Luftwaffe operations by preventing fighter escorts from providing continuous protection for bombers throughout their missions over Britain. German bombers operating beyond the range of single-engine fighter cover were vulnerable to RAF fighters that could attack with minimal interference, forcing bombers to rely entirely on their own defensive armament and on tight formations that reduced bombing effectiveness. The twin-engine Bf 110 heavy fighters that were supposed to provide long-range escort proved disastrously vulnerable to RAF single-engine fighters and required their own fighter escort, actually increasing rather than solving the escort problem. German intelligence failures about British capabilities, resources, and defensive organization contributed significantly to operational failures when Luftwaffe forces encountered opposition far stronger than anticipated. The persistent underestimation of British fighter production and pilot training capacity led to continued operations based on false assumptions that Fighter Command was being destroyed, when in fact it was recovering from earlier losses and becoming stronger rather than weaker. The failure to understand how radar allowed British fighters to intercept raids with such consistent effectiveness meant that German tactical approaches never adapted to counter the technical advantages that radar provided. The strategic incoherence of German objectives contributed to failure by preventing sustained focus on any single approach long enough to determine whether it would succeed. The shifts from attacking shipping to attacking airfields to attacking cities reflected confusion about what the campaign was trying to achieve and prevented the sustained pressure on any single target set that might have produced decisive results. The diversion from attacking Fighter Command airfields in late August, just when that campaign was achieving significant success, and when Fighter Command was approaching its breaking point, represented a catastrophic strategic error that handed Britain the respite needed to recover. The human dimension of the battle, the courage and sacrifice of the approximately 320 RAF pilots who flew combat operations during the campaign, became legendary and provided Britain with heroes when the nation desperately needed them. Churchill's famous speech praising the few captured the public's gratitude and the recognition that these young men, mostly in their early 20s, had stood between Britain and invasion during the nation's most desperate hour. The pilots themselves were ordinary young men from Britain, the Commonwealth, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and other occupied nations who had volunteered to fight, who flew missions day after day despite exhaustion and fear, and who watched friends die while knowing their own survival was increasingly unlikely as casualties mounted. The experience of RAF fighter pilots during the summer and autumn of 1940 was characterized by a mixture of excitement, terror, exhaustion, and grim determination that few who did not share it could fully understand. Pilots would be scrambled multiple times daily, climbing to altitude while being vectored toward incoming raids, engaging in brief and violent combat that might last only minutes, but that felt endless while it occurred, and then landing to refuel and rearm before being scrambled again if more raids were detected. The intensity of operations left pilots chronically exhausted, sleeping whenever possible between sorties, too tired to do much besides eat and sleep during any spare moments. The fear was constant and inescapable, though pilots learned to function despite it through training, discipline, and the mutual support that developed among squadron mates. Every sortie might be the last. Every combat engagement carried the possibility of being shot down and killed or horribly burned, and the constant awareness of mortality wore on pilots psychologically even when they survived physically. The sight of aircraft exploding in flames or spinning out of control with pilots trapped inside, the knowledge that friends who had been alive that morning were dead by afternoon, the cumulative stress of sustained combat operations, all contributed to psychological strain that manifested in various ways, from insomnia to nightmares to the 1,000-yard stare that veterans recognize as combat fatigue. The Luftwaffe bomber crews faced their own ordeal, flying missions over Britain, knowing that RAF fighters would intercept them, that they would have to maintain formation discipline despite aircraft being shot down around them, and that survival depended on luck as much as skill. The defensive gunners aboard German bombers fired thousands of rounds at attacking fighters, occasionally scoring hits that damaged or destroyed attacking aircraft, but more often simply trying to disrupt attacks enough that bombs would hit somewhere near their intended targets. The crew coordination required to keep bombers flying in formation while under fighter attack, to navigate to targets despite battle damage and casualties, and to return to bases in France with damaged aircraft and wounded crewmen, demanded courage and discipline that German bomber crews displayed consistently even as losses mounted. German fighter pilots faced their own challenges, escorting bombers to targets in Britain while operating at extreme range, engaging RAF fighters that were defending their homeland and that could break off combat when convenient to land, refuel, and return, while German pilots had to carefully manage fuel to ensure they could return to bases in France. The frustration of having to abandon bombers when fuel ran low, of watching bombers being attacked during withdrawal when fighters could no longer protect them, of being unable to pursue damaged RAF fighters because fuel limitations demanded immediate return to base, all contributed to German pilot morale problems that worsened as the campaign continued without achieving its objectives. The ground crews supporting both air forces worked exhausting hours, keeping aircraft operational, repairing battle damage, replacing destroyed aircraft with new production, and maintaining the infrastructure that allowed sustained air operations. RAF ground crews performed near miracles keeping fighters flying despite shortages of spare parts and despite damage to airfields from German bombing. German ground crews based in occupied France worked under less immediate threat, but faced challenges maintaining aircraft deployed far from German repair facilities and dealing with accumulating wear on aircraft that were being flown far more intensively than peacetime maintenance schedules anticipated. The civilians who lived under the bombing, particularly in London and other cities that were heavily attacked during the Blitz, demonstrated resilience that surprised both British authorities and German planners who had expected that bombing would break civilian morale and force the government to seek peace. The bombing killed approximately 40,000 British civilians during the Blitz from September 1940 through May 1941, destroyed or damaged millions of homes, disrupted transportation and utilities, and created widespread hardship. But civilian morale did not collapse, and if anything, the shared suffering strengthened determination to resist and created national unity that transcended pre-war class divisions and regional differences. The Battle of Britain's immediate strategic significance was that it prevented German invasion by denying the Luftwaffe the air supremacy that Operation Sea Lion required to succeed. Without control of the air over the English Channel and southern England, German invasion forces would be extremely vulnerable to RAF attacks on transport ships and landing forces, to Royal Navy operations against invasion convoys, and to continued British resistance that would make any landing extraordinarily costly, even if initial assault succeeded. Hitler's decision to postpone and eventually cancel the invasion reflected recognition that achieving air supremacy had proven impossible, and that invasion without it would likely fail catastrophically. The longer-term strategic significance was that Britain survived 1940 as the only European nation actively resisting Germany, providing a base for subsequent Allied operations, a haven for governments in exile from occupied nations, and a symbol that resistance was possible and that Germany was not invincible. The survival ensured that Britain would remain in the war until the Soviet Union and United States entered, creating the alliance that would eventually defeat Germany. Had Britain been invaded and conquered or forced to negotiate peace in 1940, the entire subsequent course of World War II would have been different in ways impossible to predict, but that would almost certainly have favored Germany's strategic position. The Battle of Britain demonstrated that radar and integrated air defense systems provided decisive advantages in defensive air operations, lessons that would influence air defense doctrine for decades and that remain relevant today. The campaign showed that air superiority could not be achieved simply through numerical superiority when the defending side possessed technical advantages and integrated systems that multiplied the effectiveness of limited forces. The British approach of using technology to achieve force multiplication became a model for subsequent air defense systems and influenced NATO defensive planning throughout the Cold War. The campaign also revealed that strategic bombing, at least as practiced in 1940 with available technology and doctrine, could not achieve decisive results against a determined opponent with robust defenses and strong national will. The failure of bombing to break British civilian morale or to cripple British war production foreshadowed the limited effectiveness of strategic bombing campaigns throughout World War II, despite the enormous resources devoted to them by all sides. The lesson that air power alone could not force national surrender would have to be relearned repeatedly as air forces continued believing that improved technology and better tactics would eventually make strategic bombing decisive. The personal cost of the Battle of Britain was measured in the approximately 500 RAF Fighter Command pilots killed during the campaign, young men mostly in their 20s who died in aircraft shot down over Britain or the English Channel. Each death represented not just the loss of a trained pilot, but the destruction of potential, of futures that would never be realized, of families who would mourn their loss for the remainder of their lives. The survivors carried physical scars from burns and injuries, and psychological scars from sustained combat that many never fully processed or recovered from, despite living for decades after the war ended. The commemoration of the Battle of Britain became an annual event in Britain and throughout the Commonwealth, ceremonies that honor the few who defended Britain during its most desperate hour. The RAF conducts flypasts featuring surviving Spitfires and Hurricanes. Veterans attend ceremonies, though their numbers have dwindled to a handful as the generation that fought the battle is past. And the British public remembers the sacrifice through various observances that ensure the battle remains part of national memory. The date of September 15th, Battle of Britain Day, is marked by special ceremonies and by media coverage that explains to younger generations what occurred and why it mattered. The historiography of the Battle of Britain has evolved over decades as researchers gained access to German archives, as technological analysis revealed capabilities and limitations of aircraft and systems used during the campaign, and as partisan accounts written immediately after the war were balanced against more objective historical assessments. Early accounts emphasized British heroism and German failure, without fully examining the complex factors that influenced outcomes. Later scholarship provided more nuanced understanding of both sides' capabilities, strategies, and the multiple factors that contributed to British survival. The debate among historians about whether the Battle of Britain represented a decisive turning point or merely one campaign among many continues without consensus. Some argue that German failure to achieve air supremacy and the consequent cancellation of Operation Sea Lion was the crucial moment when Britain's survival was assured and when eventual Allied victory became possible. Others contend that Germany never seriously intended to invade Britain, that Operation Sea Lion was more threat than genuine operational plan, and that the battle's significance has been exaggerated by British national mythology that required a dramatic story of survival against overwhelming odds. The truth likely lies between these extremes. Germany genuinely intended invasion if air supremacy could be achieved, making the Luftwaffe's failure to destroy Fighter Command significant in preventing invasion that would have occurred had circumstances been different. But the battle was one of many factors determining the war's outcome, and Britain's survival depended on multiple factors beyond just defeating the Luftwaffe during summer and autumn 1940. The economic support provided by the United States, the survival of British sea power that maintained connections to the empire, the eventual entry of the Soviet Union and United States into the war, all contributed to the eventual outcome in ways that the Battle of Britain alone could not have determined. The aircraft that fought the battle, particularly the Supermarine Spitfire and the Messerschmitt Bf 109, became legendary and remain among the most recognizable and celebrated military aircraft ever built. The Spitfire especially became a symbol of British resistance, its elliptical wings and distinctive sound forever associated with the battle. The survival of numerous Spitfires and Hurricanes in museums and with private collectors ensures that future generations can see the actual aircraft that defended Britain rather than just reading about them or seeing photographs. The pilots who flew these aircraft, particularly those who survived the war and lived into old age, became reluctant celebrities, asked to recount their experiences at commemorations and to school groups studying the battle. Most preferred to remember fallen comrades rather than to claim personal glory, understanding that survival was often luck as much as skill, and that many better pilots died while less capable pilots survived through chance. The modesty and humility that characterized most Battle of Britain veterans contrasted with the heroic image that popular culture assigned to them, creating tension between how they saw themselves and how they were seen by others. The Battle of Britain marked Britain's finest hour, not because British forces won a decisive victory that changed the war's course immediately, but because Britain survived when survival seemed impossible, because ordinary young men did extraordinary things when their nation required it, and because the battle demonstrated that determined resistance could defeat what had appeared to be unstoppable German military power. The summer and autumn of 1940, when Fighter Command pilots climbed into Spitfires and Hurricanes day after day to intercept German bombers, represents a moment when individuals made history through their courage, when technology and organization multiplied human capabilities, and when a nation facing existential threat found the will to continue fighting despite terrible costs and uncertain prospects for ultimate victory.